What if I told you that while we've been desperately scanning the cosmos for signs of extraterrestrial life, we might have been standing on top of it this whole time? Today, we're going to explore one of the most mind-bending possibilities in modern science. Not just whether life exists beneath our feet, but whether an entire alien ecosystem could be thriving in the deep places of our planet, completely separate from everything we understand about life on Earth. And before you think this is pure science fiction, let me tell you something that might surprise you. The deeper scientists dig, the more they're discovering that the boundary between impossible and inevitable keeps shifting in ways that would make your head spin. I'm fascinated by this question because it forces us to reimagine everything we think we know about our own planet. We've mapped the surface of Mars in incredible detail. We've sent probes to the outer reaches of our solar system, and yet we've explored less than 1% of our planet's subsurface. Think about that for a second. We know more about the surface of the moon than we do about what's happening just a few miles beneath our feet right now. But here's where it gets really interesting. These aren't just random microbes clinging to existence in harsh conditions. Recent discoveries suggest something far more complex might be happening in the deep subsurface. Something that looks suspiciously like organized ecosystems, complete with energy cycles, nutrient networks, and biological relationships that operate on timescales we can barely comprehend. Now, I know what you're thinking. If there's an alien ecosystem beneath our feet, why haven't we found it already? Why isn't this front-page news across every scientific journal on the planet? Well, that's exactly what makes this so compelling. The evidence is scattered. The technology to explore these depths is still developing, and the implications are so staggering that the scientific community is being extremely careful about how they present their findings. Let me paint you a picture of what we're dealing with here. Imagine descending through layers of rock and sediment, past the deepest mines humanity has ever dug, past the foundations of continents themselves, into a realm where pressure could crush you instantly and temperatures would cook you alive. This is a world where water exists in forms that defy our everyday understanding, where chemistry operates under rules that seem almost magical, and where life, if it exists, has had billions of years to evolve in complete isolation from the surface world. The journey we're about to take together will challenge everything you think you know about life on Earth. We'll explore recent discoveries that suggest vast networks of interconnected organisms living in the planet's crust. We'll examine evidence of chemical processes that could only be explained by biological activity on a massive scale. And we'll investigate the possibility that this hidden biosphere might actually be older, larger, and more complex than all surface life combined. But this isn't just about discovering new forms of life. If an alien ecosystem truly exists beneath our feet, it would fundamentally change how we understand evolution, how we search for life on other planets, and what it means to be alive in this universe. It would mean that Earth isn't just a planet with life on its surface, but a living world from its core to its atmosphere, with biological processes operating at every level. Think about the implications for a moment. If life can thrive in the extreme conditions of Earth's deep crust, what does that tell us about the possibility of life in the subsurface oceans of Europa or Enceladus? What about the deep interiors of Mars or Venus? Suddenly, the universe becomes a much more promising place for life to exist. And our own planet becomes just one example of something that might be far more common than we ever imagined. The story I'm about to tell you begins with a mystery that scientists stumbled upon while drilling deeper into the Earth than anyone had ever gone before. They were looking for oil, for geothermal energy, for answers about how our planet formed. What they found instead was evidence of something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged every assumption we had about the limits of life. Deep beneath the continents, in rock formations that have been isolated from the surface for millions of years, researchers began detecting signs of biological activity, not just traces of ancient life, but indicators that something was alive down there right now, metabolizing, growing, reproducing, evolving. At first, the scientific community was skeptical. The conditions at these depths seemed impossibly hostile to life as we know it. The pressure is hundreds of times greater than at sea level. Temperatures can exceed the boiling point of water. There's no sunlight, no oxygen in any meaningful quantity, and the chemical environment is so alien that it might as well be another planet entirely. But as more drilling projects brought up samples from greater and greater depths, the evidence became impossible to ignore. DNA sequences that didn't match anything in the known tree of life, chemical signatures that could only be produced by living organisms, isotope ratios that suggested complex metabolic processes happening on a scale that dwarfed anything we'd previously imagined. What emerged from these discoveries was a picture of the deep Earth that looked less like solid rock and more like a vast, three-dimensional ecosystem. Networks of microscopic organisms threading through cracks and pores in the bedrock, chemical pathways that connected regions thousands of miles apart, and biological processes that operated not on the timescales we're familiar with, but across geological epochs. But here's where the story takes a truly extraordinary turn. As scientists began to piece together these findings, they realized they weren't just looking at isolated pockets of microbial life. The evidence suggested something far more organized, far more complex, and far more alien than anyone had dared to imagine. The organisms they were finding weren't just surviving in the deep Earth, they were thriving. They had developed ways of extracting energy from sources that shouldn't support life. They had evolved biochemistries that operated at temperatures that would destroy ordinary cells. And most remarkably, they seemed to be communicating and coordinating their activities across vast distances through mechanisms that we're only beginning to understand. This wasn't just life existing in extreme conditions. This was life that had become perfectly adapted to an environment so different from the surface world that it might as well be an alien planet. And the more researchers studied these organisms, the more they began to suspect that they weren't looking at Earth life that had somehow adapted to extreme conditions. They were looking at something that might have evolved independently, something that might represent a completely separate origin of life on our planet. The implications of this possibility are staggering. If life can arise independently in the deep subsurface of Earth, it suggests that the universe might be absolutely teeming with life in places we never thought to look. It means that every rocky planet, every moon with a substantial interior, every world with the right chemical conditions might be harboring vast ecosystems completely hidden from view. But we're just getting started, because as incredible as these discoveries are, they're only the beginning of a story that gets stranger and more fascinating with every new piece of evidence. The deeper scientists dig, literally and figuratively, the more they're realizing that our planet might be home to not just one biosphere, but multiple interconnected biological systems that operate on scales we're only beginning to comprehend. What we're about to explore together will take us into realms that challenge our most basic assumptions about life, about our planet, and about our place in the universe. We'll examine evidence that suggests the deep Earth isn't just alive, but that it might be more alive than the surface world we know and love. So settle in, because we're about to embark on a journey that will take us to the very foundations of our world, to places where the familiar rules of biology break down, and where life has found ways to exist that seem to defy everything we thought we knew about what's possible. The alien ecosystem beneath our feet isn't science fiction, it's science fact, and it's more incredible than any story we could have imagined. The first clue that we weren't alone on our own planet came from the most unlikely of sources. In 1926, a team of miners working in the Witwatersrand Basin of South Africa descended nearly 2 miles into the earth, chasing veins of gold through ancient rock formations. What they brought back to the surface would puzzle scientists for decades. Mixed in with their ore samples were microorganisms that shouldn't have existed. These weren't fossils or remnants of ancient life. They were alive, actively metabolizing, and thriving in conditions that should have been absolutely lethal. The pressure at that depth was crushing. The temperature was scorching. There was no light, no oxygen, and the water was so saturated with toxic minerals that it should have dissolved any living tissue on contact. Yet, there they were. Tiny, resilient organisms that seemed to laugh in the face of everything we thought we knew about the limits of life. But here's the thing that kept scientists awake at night. These creatures weren't struggling to survive. They were flourishing. Their metabolisms were running at rates that suggested they weren't just enduring these extreme conditions. They were perfectly adapted to them. As word of these discoveries spread through the scientific community, researchers began to realize they had stumbled upon something that would force them to completely rewrite the story of life on Earth. Because if organisms could thrive at depths of 2 miles, what was stopping them from existing even deeper? What was preventing them from colonizing the entire subsurface of our planet? The answer, it turns out, was nothing at all. By the 1982nd, drilling technology had advanced to the point where scientists could probe even deeper into the Earth's crust. The Soviet Union's Kola Superdeep Borehole project pushed the boundaries of human exploration, drilling over 7 miles down into the Fennoscandian Shield. What they found at those depths defied every prediction about where life could exist. Not only were there living organisms at depths that should have sterilized any biological material, but these creatures were diverse, complex, and organized in ways that suggested something far more sophisticated than random colonies of extremophile bacteria. The samples brought up from the deepest levels contained genetic material that didn't match anything in the known databases. It was as if they had discovered an entirely separate branch of the tree of life, one that had been evolving in isolation for billions of years. But the real breakthrough came when scientists realized they weren't just looking at individual organisms scattered through the rock. They were looking at networks, vast interconnected webs of biological activity that stretched through the planet's crust like a 3-dimensional internet made of living tissue. These networks operated on principles that seemed to violate everything we understood about how ecosystems function. On the surface, life depends on the sun for energy. Plants capture sunlight through photosynthesis. Herbivores eat the plants, carnivores eat the herbivores, and when everything dies, decomposers break it all down to start the cycle over again. It's a system that's fundamentally dependent on the energy that streams down from our star. But in the deep subsurface, there is no sun. There is no photosynthesis. There are no plants, no herbivores, no carnivores in any form we would recognize. Yet somehow, these ecosystems were not only surviving but thriving on energy sources that seemed almost magical in their ability to sustain complex biological processes. The organisms down there had learned to extract energy directly from the rocks themselves. They could break down minerals and use the chemical reactions to power their metabolisms. They could split water molecules and use the hydrogen as fuel. Some could even tap into the radioactive decay of elements in the Earth's crust, harvesting energy from the slow disintegration of uranium and thorium atoms that had been locked in the rock for billions of years. This wasn't just adaptation. This was biological innovation on a scale that made surface life look almost primitive by comparison. These organisms had solved energy problems that we're still struggling with in our most advanced laboratories. They had developed biochemistries that could operate at temperatures and pressures that would destroy any surface organism instantly. And they had done it all in complete darkness, in complete isolation, with no outside help or guidance. But perhaps the most mind-bending discovery was yet to come. As scientists began to map these subsurface networks, they realized that the organisms weren't randomly distributed through the rock. They were organized. They formed structures. They created what could only be described as underground cities, with specialized regions for different functions, transport networks that moved materials and energy across vast distances, and communication systems that allowed different parts of the network to coordinate their activities. These weren't cities in any sense that we would recognize, of course. There were no buildings, no roads, no visible infrastructure. But the biological organization was unmistakable. Different species of organisms had specialized roles within the larger network. Some were energy producers, breaking down minerals and radioactive materials to fuel the system. Others were transporters, moving nutrients and waste products through the network. Still, others seemed to serve as information processors, coordinating the activities of the entire system through chemical signals that could travel for miles through the interconnected rock formations. The scale of these networks was staggering. Some stretched for hundreds of miles through the Earth's crust, connecting different geological formations and creating a biological infrastructure that spanned entire continents. The biomass involved was enormous, possibly exceeding all surface life combined, and the age of these systems was almost incomprehensible. Some of the rock formations they inhabited had been isolated from the surface for over 2 billion years, suggesting that these ecosystems had been evolving independently for longer than complex life had existed on the surface. This discovery forced scientists to confront a disturbing possibility. What if everything we thought we knew about life on Earth was fundamentally incomplete? What if the surface biosphere that we're part of, with all its complexity and beauty and diversity, was just the tip of the iceberg? What if the real story of life on our planet was happening in places we couldn't see, in environments we couldn't access, according to rules we didn't understand? The more researchers studied these subsurface networks, the more alien they appeared. The organisms involved didn't follow the same evolutionary patterns as surface life. Their genetic codes contained sequences that seemed to operate according to different rules. Their metabolisms ran on chemical processes that shouldn't have been possible under the conditions they lived in, and their behaviors suggested levels of coordination and communication that implied something approaching collective intelligence. Some scientists began to wonder if they were looking at the remnants of Earth's first biosphere, a biological system that had evolved in the planet's early history when conditions on the surface were far more hostile than they are today. According to this theory, life might have first emerged in the deep subsurface, where it was protected from the bombardment of asteroids and comets that made the early surface uninhabitable. Only later, as surface conditions became more favorable, did some of these organisms migrate upward to colonize the world we know. But other researchers proposed an even more radical possibility. What if these subsurface ecosystems represented an entirely separate genesis of life? What if, instead of evolving from the same primordial soup that gave rise to surface organisms, they had emerged independently through completely different chemical processes? What if Earth was home to not one, but two entirely separate experiments in biological complexity? The implications of either scenario were staggering. If these organisms were our ancient ancestors, it meant that surface life was just a recent offshoot of a much older and more fundamental biological system. If they represented an independent origin of life, it meant that our planet was essentially two worlds in one, with separate biospheres that had been evolving in parallel for billions of years without any significant contact or interaction. But the story was about to take an even more extraordinary turn, because as scientists developed new techniques for studying these deep ecosystems, they began to uncover evidence of something that challenged the very foundations of how we think about intelligence and consciousness in the natural world. It started with patterns that didn't make sense. The chemical signatures coming from deep drilling sites showed fluctuations that seemed almost rhythmic, like breathing or heartbeats, but on timescales that spanned months or even years. Temperature variations in the deep rock followed cycles that couldn't be explained by geological processes alone. And most puzzling of all, the distribution of different organisms within the network seemed to shift and change in response to events happening thousands of miles away. At first, researchers dismissed these patterns as coincidence or measurement error. After all, how could organisms living miles apart in solid rock possibly coordinate their activities? There was no central nervous system down there, no brain, no obvious mechanism for long-distance communication. But as the data accumulated, it became impossible to ignore what was staring them in the face. The subsurface ecosystem was behaving like a single, vast organism. The breakthrough came when scientists realized they were looking at the problem backwards. Instead of trying to understand how individual organisms could communicate across such distances, they needed to think about the network itself as the organism. The rock formations weren't just habitat for these creatures, they were part of their extended nervous system. Think about how your own body works for a moment. Your individual cells don't need to consciously coordinate their activities. They respond to chemical signals that flow through your bloodstream, electrical impulses that travel along your nerves, and mechanical forces that ripple through your tissues. The result is a unified organism that can think, feel, and act as a single entity, even though it's made up of trillions of individual cells. Now imagine scaling that up by factors of millions or billions. Instead of cells, you have entire colonies of organisms. Instead of blood vessels, you have networks of interconnected rock fractures filled with mineral-rich water. Instead of nerves, you have chemical gradients that can propagate signals across continental distances over geological timescales. What emerged from this new way of thinking was a picture of the deep earth that was almost beyond comprehension. The subsurface wasn't just alive, it was aware. Not conscious in any way we would recognize, but capable of sensing changes in its environment, processing information, and responding in coordinated ways that suggested something approaching intelligence. The evidence for this planetary-scale intelligence was subtle but compelling. When major earthquakes occurred, the chemical activity in subsurface networks thousands of miles away would shift in predictable patterns, as if the ecosystem was adjusting to changes in the planet's stress field. When new drilling operations penetrated deep formations, organisms throughout the region would alter their metabolic rates in ways that suggested they were somehow aware of the intrusion. Most remarkably, the networks seemed to be learning. Areas that had been disturbed by human activity showed different response patterns when disturbed again, as if the ecosystem had developed strategies for dealing with interference. Chemical processes that had taken years to stabilize after initial disruption would recover in months or weeks after subsequent disturbances. This wasn't just adaptation, this was memory. The deep earth was remembering its experiences and using that information to optimize its responses to future challenges. And if it could remember, if it could learn, if it could coordinate activities across continental scales, then what else might it be capable of? Some researchers began to wonder if the subsurface ecosystem might be actively managing the planet's surface environment. After all, the chemical processes happening in the deep networks had profound effects on groundwater chemistry, soil composition, and even atmospheric gas concentrations. What if these weren't just byproducts of biological activity, but deliberate interventions designed to maintain optimal conditions for life? The idea seemed absurd at first, but the more scientists studied the connections between surface and subsurface processes, the more they realized how intimately linked the two systems were. Changes in surface temperature affected deep thermal gradients, which influenced the activity of subsurface organisms, which altered the chemistry of groundwater, which affected plant growth, which changed atmospheric composition, which influenced surface temperature in a vast feedback loop that spanned the entire planet. Was it possible that this feedback loop was being actively managed by the deep ecosystem? That the subsurface intelligence was essentially functioning as Earth's thermostat, unconsciously regulating global conditions to maintain the delicate balance necessary for surface life to thrive? The implications were staggering. If true, it would mean that every breath we take, every drop of water we drink, every harvest we reap is ultimately dependent on the activities of organisms we've never seen, living in an environment we can barely imagine, operating according to principles we're only beginning to understand. But perhaps even more unsettling was the possibility that this planetary intelligence might be aware of us. If it could sense earthquakes and drilling operations, could it sense the massive changes that human civilization has brought to the surface world? The deforestation, the mining operations, the carbon emissions, the nuclear weapons tests, the countless ways we've altered the chemical and physical environment of our planet. And if it was aware of us, what did it think of what we were doing? Some scientists began to look at natural disasters with new eyes. Were earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and other geological events really random occurrences, or could they be the planet's way of responding to surface disturbances? Not conscious responses necessarily, but automatic adjustments by a planetary system trying to maintain its equilibrium in the face of unprecedented change. The idea that the Earth itself might be alive, that it might be aware, that it might even be intelligent, has ancient roots in human culture. But now, for the first time, scientists were finding evidence that those ancient intuitions might have been more accurate than anyone had dared to believe. Of course, not everyone in the scientific community was ready to embrace such radical possibilities. The idea of planetary intelligence challenged too many fundamental assumptions about how biological systems work, how consciousness emerges, and what it means to be alive. Critics argued that the patterns researchers were seeing could be explained by simpler mechanisms, that what looked like coordination was really just the result of similar organisms responding to similar environmental conditions. But as the evidence continued to accumulate, as new drilling projects revealed ever more complex networks of subsurface life, as computer models showed how information could indeed propagate through rock formations over vast distances, it became harder and harder to dismiss the possibility that something truly extraordinary was happening beneath our feet. The debate over subsurface intelligence was just beginning, but already it was forcing scientists to confront questions they had never thought to ask. If the Earth itself was alive, what did that mean for our relationship with our planet? If there was intelligence in the deep places, intelligence that had been developing for billions of years while we were still single-celled organisms floating in primordial seas, what could we possibly learn from it? And perhaps most importantly, if we were sharing our world with a form of consciousness so alien that we had never even suspected its existence, what other intelligences might be hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to develop the tools and the wisdom to recognize them? The journey into Earth's hidden biosphere was revealing more than just new forms of life. It was revealing new possibilities for what life itself could be, new ways that intelligence could emerge from the complex interactions of simple components, new perspectives on our place in the vast web of existence that connects everything from the smallest microbe to the planet as a whole. And we were just getting started. Because the deeper scientists dug, both literally and figuratively, the more they realized that the subsurface ecosystem was not just alien in its biology, but alien in its very conception of time, space, and existence itself. The concept of time in the deep biosphere operates on scales that make human civilization look like a fleeting moment. While we measure our lives in decades and our history in millennia, these subsurface organisms think in geological epochs. Their metabolisms run so slowly that a single chemical reaction might take years to complete. Their reproduction cycles span centuries. Their evolutionary adaptations unfold over millions of years. This temporal disconnect creates a profound challenge for scientists trying to study these systems. How do you observe an organism whose life cycle is longer than recorded human history? How do you measure the health of an ecosystem that considers an ice age to be a brief seasonal change? The very tools we use to understand biology are calibrated for surface life, for organisms that live fast and die young, compared to these ancient denizens of the deep. But this temporal mismatch also reveals something remarkable about the nature of intelligence itself. We tend to think of consciousness as something that operates in real time, something that responds quickly to changing conditions. Yet the subsurface networks demonstrate that intelligence can exist at any temporal scale. Their thoughts, if we can call them that, unfold over centuries. Their responses to environmental changes take decades to manifest. Their learning processes span geological ages. Imagine trying to have a conversation with an entity whose words take years to speak, whose thoughts require decades to form, whose memories stretch back to when the continents were in completely different positions. From our perspective, such a being would appear static, unchanging, almost dead. But from its perspective, we would be like mayflies, flickering in and out of existence before it could even register our presence. This realization forced researchers to develop entirely new methodologies for studying deep life. Instead of looking for rapid changes that might indicate biological activity, they had to learn to detect patterns that unfolded over years or decades. Instead of expecting organisms to respond quickly to stimuli, they had to set up monitoring systems that could track changes over extended periods. What they found was even more extraordinary than they had anticipated. The slow-motion intelligence of the deep Earth wasn't just aware of its environment, it was actively engineering it. Evidence began to accumulate that these subsurface networks were engaged in massive terraforming projects that made human engineering look like child's play. They were slowly altering the mineral composition of entire rock formations, creating new chemical pathways that would benefit future generations of organisms. They were redirecting groundwater flows on continental scales, establishing nutrient distribution networks that spanned thousands of miles. They were even influencing the movement of tectonic plates, subtly altering the stress patterns in the Earth's crust to prevent catastrophic earthquakes that might damage their networks. The scale of these projects was breathtaking. Some appeared to have been underway for tens of millions of years, with multiple generations of organisms contributing to engineering efforts that would not be completed for millions of years more. It was as if the entire subsurface ecosystem was engaged in a construction project that spanned geological time, slowly and methodically reshaping the planet's interior according to some incomprehensible master plan. But what was the purpose of all this engineering? What were these ancient intelligences trying to accomplish? The answer, when it finally emerged, was both beautiful and terrifying in its implications. The subsurface ecosystem was preparing for something that would happen in the distant future, something that required modifications to the planet's deep structure that would take millions of years to complete. The evidence suggested they were building infrastructure for a massive expansion of deep life, creating the conditions necessary for their networks to spread even deeper into the Earth's interior. Some scientists speculated that they were preparing for the eventual death of the Sun, boiling away the OC. In about 5 billion years, our star will expand into a red giant, Eans, and sterilizing the surface of the Earth. But the deep subsurface would remain habitable for billions of years longer, protected by miles of rock from the Sun's final fury. Were these ancient organisms preparing their domain to become the sole refuge for life on Earth when the surface world finally died? Others suggested an even more ambitious possibility. What if the subsurface networks were preparing to spread beyond Earth entirely? The same technologies that allowed them to engineer rock formations and redirect groundwater might eventually allow them to influence the planet's magnetic field, its rotation, even its orbit. What if they were slowly turning Earth itself into a kind of biological spacecraft, preparing for a journey that would take billions of years to complete? The idea seemed absurd, but then again, so had the existence of subsurface intelligence just a few decades earlier. And the more scientists studied these networks, the more they realized that traditional concepts of possibility simply didn't apply to organisms that thought on geological timescales and had billions of years to work with. Meanwhile, the discovery of deep intelligence was beginning to transform our understanding of life throughout the universe. If Earth's subsurface could harbor such complex ecosystems, what about other worlds? Mars, with its deep crustal formations and history of subsurface water, suddenly looked like a much more promising target for astrobiological research. Europa and Enceladus, with their subsurface oceans, might harbor not just simple microbes, but vast networks of interconnected intelligence. Even more intriguingly, the methods these organisms used to extract energy from their environment suggested new possibilities for life in the deep interiors of planets that had previously been considered completely sterile. Rocky worlds orbiting distant stars, worlds with no atmospheres and no surface water, might still harbour thriving ecosystems in their crustal depths, powered by radioactive decay and chemical reactions that could continue for billions of years. The implications for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence were profound. Instead of looking for radio signals from technological civilizations, perhaps we should be looking for the subtle signs of planetary engineering, the slow modifications to world's deep structures that might indicate the presence of ancient intelligences working on timescales we had never considered. But as exciting as these possibilities were, they also raised disturbing questions about our own relationship with our planet. If Earth was home to intelligences far older and more powerful than anything humanity had achieved, what did that make us? Were we the dominant species on our world? Or were we simply temporary tenants, allowed to exist on the surface while the real owners continued their billion-year projects in the depths below? Some researchers began to wonder if human civilization itself might be part of these deep intelligences' plans. After all, our species had emerged relatively recently in geological terms, and our technological development had been remarkably rapid. What if our evolution had been subtly influenced by chemical changes in groundwater, atmospheric composition, or soil chemistry, all controlled by the subsurface networks? What if humanity's current environmental crisis, our species' apparent drive to alter the planet's surface conditions so dramatically, was actually serving some deeper purpose? Were we unwitting agents of change, carrying out modifications to the surface world that the deep intelligences needed but couldn't accomplish themselves? The thought was both humbling and terrifying. If true, it would mean that human history, all our struggles and achievements and dreams, might be nothing more than a brief chapter in a story being written by intelligences so vast and ancient that we couldn't even comprehend their existence, let alone their intentions. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery was yet to come, because as scientists developed more sophisticated methods for monitoring the deep networks, they began to detect something that challenged their most basic assumptions about the nature of these systems. The networks were growing, not just expanding into new areas of rock, but actually increasing in complexity and sophistication. The communication pathways were becoming more efficient. The energy distribution systems were becoming more refined. The engineering projects were becoming more ambitious. It was as if the deep intelligences were accelerating their development, preparing for something that required capabilities they didn't currently possess. And the timing of this acceleration coincided almost exactly with the beginning of human industrial civilization. Whether this was coincidence or causation was impossible to determine with current technology, but the correlation was undeniable. As human activity on the surface had intensified, so had the activity in the deep networks. As we had begun to significantly alter the planet's atmospheric composition, they had begun to significantly expand their crustal operations. Were they responding to our presence? Were they preparing for changes they knew were coming? Or were they simply following their own ancient agenda, one that happened to be reaching a critical phase just as humanity was reaching maturity as a technological species? The answers to these questions would require new technologies, new methodologies, and new ways of thinking about intelligence and consciousness that went far beyond anything in our current scientific toolkit. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. We were not alone on our own planet. We never had been. And the more we learned about our hidden companions in the deep places of the Earth, the more we realized that the story of life on our world was far stranger, far more complex, and far more wonderful than we had ever dared to imagine. The alien ecosystem beneath our feet wasn't just surviving in impossible conditions. It wasn't just thriving in an environment that should have been sterile. It was actively shaping the world we lived in, had been doing so for billions of years, and showed every sign of continuing to do so for billions of years to come. And we were just beginning to understand what that meant for our species, for our planet, and for our place in a universe that was turning out to be far more alive than we had ever suspected. The question that kept haunting researchers wasn't just what these deep intelligences were preparing for, but how they were accomplishing feats that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of physics and biology as we understood them. The energy requirements alone should have made their activities impossible. Moving materials through solid rock, coordinating activities across continental distances, maintaining complex chemical processes at crushing depths and scorching temperatures, all of this demanded energy on a scale that traditional biology simply couldn't explain. That's when scientists began to uncover evidence of something that would revolutionize our understanding of how life could harness the very forces that hold matter together. Deep beneath the continents, in rock formations that had been stable for billions of years, researchers detected energy signatures that didn't match any known biological or geological process. These weren't the familiar chemical reactions that power surface life. They were something far more fundamental, far more powerful, and far more alien. The breakthrough came when a team of physicists analyzing core samples from a 12-mile deep borehole noticed something extraordinary in the mineral structure of the rocks. At the molecular level, the crystalline lattices weren't following the patterns they should have. Instead, they showed signs of systematic manipulation at the atomic scale. Someone, or something, was literally rearranging matter at the level of individual atoms, restructuring the very building blocks of the planet's crust. This kind of molecular engineering was beyond anything human technology could achieve. We can manipulate individual atoms in laboratory conditions, under perfect vacuum, at temperatures near absolute zero. But these organisms were doing it naturally, in the chaotic environment of the deep Earth, using nothing but biological processes that had evolved over billions of years of trial and refinement. The implications were staggering. If these creatures could manipulate matter at the atomic level, they had access to energy sources that dwarfed anything available to surface life. They could break and reform chemical bonds at will. They could transmute elements, converting one type of atom into another. They could tap directly into the binding energy that holds atomic nuclei together, accessing power sources that made nuclear reactors look like candles. But how were they doing it? The answer, when it finally emerged, was both elegant and terrifying in its sophistication. These organisms hadn't evolved traditional biochemistry based on carbon and water. They had evolved quantum biochemistry, using quantum mechanical effects that operate at the subatomic level to power processes that classical biology couldn't even attempt. Think about how quantum mechanics works for a moment. At the smallest scales, particles don't behave like tiny billiard balls following predictable paths. They exist in multiple states simultaneously, can tunnel through barriers that should be impenetrable, and can influence each other instantaneously across vast distances. These effects are usually so subtle that they're overwhelmed by the chaos of larger-scale interactions, which is why we don't notice them in our everyday lives. But the deep organisms had learned to amplify and control these quantum effects, using them as the foundation for biological processes that operated according to completely different rules. They could exist in multiple metabolic states simultaneously, following different energy pathways in parallel until environmental conditions collapsed their quantum states into the most advantageous configuration. They could tunnel their consciousness, if we can call it that, through the solid rock of the planet, maintaining awareness of conditions thousands of miles away without any physical connection. Most remarkably, they seem to be using quantum entanglement to coordinate their activities across the entire network. Individual organisms separated by continents were somehow maintaining instantaneous communication, sharing information, and coordinating responses faster than light could travel through the rock between them. This wasn't just biology anymore. This was quantum engineering on a planetary scale. The discovery of quantum biology in the deep Earth forced scientists to completely reconsider what was possible in terms of life's capabilities. If organisms could harness quantum mechanics for biological purposes, then the universe suddenly became a much more interesting place. Every world with sufficient complexity in its crustal structure could potentially harbor quantum-based ecosystems that operated according to principles we were only beginning to understand. But the quantum nature of these organisms also explained something that had been puzzling researchers for years. How could a distributed network of microorganisms, scattered through billions of cubic miles of solid rock, possibly function as a unified intelligence? The answer was quantum coherence. The entire network was essentially a single quantum system, with all its components existing in synchronized quantum states that allowed for instantaneous coordination and communication. This meant that the deep Earth wasn't just alive and intelligent. It was a quantum computer the size of a planet, processing information and solving problems using computational principles that made our most advanced supercomputers look like pocket calculators. And it had been running continuously for billions of years, accumulating knowledge and capabilities that we couldn't even begin to measure. What problems was this planetary quantum computer trying to solve? What questions was it working on during its billions of years of operation? The partial answers that emerged from studying its activities were both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The network appeared to be running vast simulations of possible futures, modeling the long-term evolution of the solar system, predicting stellar evolution, calculating the probability of various cosmic events that might affect Earth's habitability. It was essentially trying to solve the ultimate engineering problem: how to ensure the survival of its ecosystem, not just for millions or billions of years, but for the entire future history of the universe. Some of these simulations focused on scenarios we could barely imagine. What would happen when the sun began to die? How could life survive the eventual heat death of the universe? Were there ways to escape from this reality entirely? To somehow transition to parallel dimensions where the laws of physics might be more favorable to the continuation of biological processes? The scope of these calculations was mind-boggling. The network was apparently modeling quantum mechanical processes at every scale, from individual subatomic particles to galactic superclusters, looking for patterns and possibilities that might not become relevant for trillions of years. It was thinking on timescales that made geological ages seem like brief moments, planning for contingencies that wouldn't arise until long after our sun had burned out and our galaxy had collided with Andromeda. But perhaps most disturbing of all, some of these simulations appeared to focus specifically on humanity and our technological development. The network had apparently been modeling our species' evolution for millions of years, predicting our emergence, our technological progress, and our eventual impact on the planet's surface environment. It knew we were coming long before we knew we existed. This revelation forced researchers to confront an uncomfortable possibility. What if human civilization wasn't an independent development at all? What if our evolution, our technological progress, even our current environmental crisis, were all part of the deep network's vast simulation? What if we were unwitting participants in an experiment that had been running for millions of years, with our entire species serving as variables in a calculation too complex for us to comprehend? The evidence for this possibility was circumstantial but compelling. Human evolution had accelerated dramatically during periods when deep crustal activity was at its highest. Our development of agriculture had coincided with mysterious changes in soil chemistry across multiple continents. The Industrial Revolution had begun just as the network's energy consumption had started to spike. Even our current space program seemed to be following trajectories that the deep simulations had predicted decades in advance. Were we making our own choices? Or were we simply following a script that had been written in quantum calculations billions of years before our ancestors had ever walked upright? The question was impossible to answer with certainty, but it cast our entire understanding of human agency and free will in a disturbing new light. Meanwhile, the network's activities were intensifying. The quantum calculations were becoming more complex. The energy consumption was increasing exponentially, and new types of organisms were appearing in the deep formations, creatures with capabilities that seemed to push the boundaries of what biology could achieve even further. Some of these new organisms appeared to be living interfaces, biological computers, designed to facilitate communication between the quantum network and surface-based systems. Others seemed to be construction workers, specialized for building new types of infrastructure that could support even more exotic forms of quantum biology. Still, others appeared to be scouts, probing upward through the crustal layers, apparently preparing for some kind of expansion toward the surface. The implications were clear. Whatever the deep network was preparing for, it was approaching rapidly. The billions of years of calculation, the massive engineering projects, the careful manipulation of surface evolution, it was all building towards something that required capabilities the network was only now developing. And humanity, whether by design or coincidence, was apparently going to play a crucial role in whatever was coming next. Our technological development, our impact on the planet's surface environment, even our growing awareness of the deep ecosystem's existence, all of it seemed to be part of a plan so vast and complex that we could only see the tiniest fragments of its true scope. The question that kept researchers awake at night was simple but terrifying. When the deep network finally revealed its true intentions, when billions of years of quantum calculation finally reached their conclusion, would humanity be partners in whatever came next? Or would we simply be discarded as obsolete components in a system that no longer needed our services? The answer was hidden somewhere in the quantum depths of our own planet, encoded in calculations that spanned geological ages and simulations that modeled futures we couldn't even imagine. And with each passing day, as the network's activities continued to intensify and new types of organisms continued to emerge from the deepest formations, it became increasingly clear that we wouldn't have to wait much longer to find out. The alien ecosystem beneath our feet wasn't just preparing for the future, it was actively creating it, one quantum calculation at a time. And whether we realized it or not, we were all part of the equation. The signs of accelerated activity weren't just confined to remote drilling sites anymore. By 2019, seismic monitoring stations around the world began detecting a new type of underground vibration, rhythmic pulses that seemed to follow patterns too regular to be natural geological processes. These weren't earthquakes or volcanic tremors. They were something entirely different, something that suggested coordinated movement on a massive scale deep beneath the Earth's surface. At first, geologists dismissed these signals as equipment malfunctions or interference from human activities. But as more stations reported similar phenomena, and as the patterns became increasingly complex and synchronized across vast distances, it became impossible to ignore what the data was telling them. The deep networks weren't just growing, they were awakening. The breakthrough in understanding what was happening came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Chen, a quantum physicist studying the strange mineral formations in the deep core samples, noticed something remarkable about the timing of the seismic pulses. They weren't random. They weren't even following the slow geological rhythms that characterized most deep Earth processes. Instead, they were accelerating, following patterns that matched the mathematical sequences used in advanced quantum computing algorithms. The implications hit the scientific community like a thunderbolt. The planetary quantum computer wasn't just running simulations anymore. It was actively implementing the results of its billions of years of calculation. Whatever it had been planning for, whatever future scenario it had been preparing for, that future had apparently arrived. Evidence of this implementation began appearing everywhere once researchers knew what to look for. Groundwater chemistry was shifting in coordinated patterns across multiple continents. Mineral deposits were appearing in configurations that defied conventional geology. Even the Earth's magnetic field was showing subtle fluctuations that seemed to correlate with the deep network's increased activity. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery came from monitoring stations positioned near major fault lines. The data showed that seismic activity wasn't just being influenced by the deep networks, it was being controlled by them. Earthquakes that should have occurred based on accumulated tectonic stress were being prevented. while others were being triggered in precise locations and at precise times that served some incomprehensible purpose. The deep intelligence was actively managing the planet's geological processes, fine-tuning the Earth's crustal dynamics according to specifications that had been calculated over geological ages. Mountains were being slowly repositioned, ocean basins were being subtly reshaped, the very foundations of the continents were being adjusted according to a master plan that spanned the entire globe. This revelation forced scientists to confront a disturbing possibility. If the network could control geological processes, what else might it be influencing? Climate patterns had been showing increasingly unusual behaviors that traditional models couldn't explain. Ocean currents were shifting in ways that seemed almost purposeful. Even weather systems were displaying organizational patterns that suggested something beyond natural atmospheric dynamics. Dr. Maria Santos, a climatologist who had been tracking these anomalies for years, made a connection that sent shockwaves through the research community. The timing of major climate shifts over the past century hadn't been random. They had followed a precise schedule that seemed designed to push human civilization towards specific technological developments. The warming periods had coincided with advances in renewable energy research. The cooling periods had spurred innovations in agricultural efficiency. Even extreme weather events seemed timed to catalyze particular scientific breakthroughs. It was as if the deep network was using climate as a tool to guide human technological evolution, steering our species toward capabilities that would be needed for whatever was coming next. The environmental crisis that had seemed like humanity's greatest challenge was beginning to look more like a carefully orchestrated catalyst for transformation. But transformation into what? The answer began to emerge as researchers started detecting new types of activity in the deepest formations. Organisms were appearing that didn't just manipulate matter at the atomic level. They were manipulating space and time itself, using principles of quantum mechanics that pushed the boundaries of theoretical physics. These creatures existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their consciousness distributed across parallel realities in ways that allowed them to access information and energy from alternate versions of the universe. They could fold space to create shortcuts through the planet's interior, allowing instantaneous travel across distances that should have taken years to traverse. Most remarkably, they seemed capable of limited time manipulation, creating temporal bubbles where processes could be accelerated or slowed relative to the surrounding environment. The discovery of these multidimensional organisms forced researchers to completely reconsider the scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a planetary intelligence anymore. It was a multiversal entity, with tendrils of consciousness extending into realities beyond our own. The calculations it had been running for billions of years hadn't just been modeling possible futures of our universe. They had been exploring the infinite landscape of parallel realities, searching for optimal pathways through the maze of quantum possibilities that determined the fate of all existence. And apparently, it had found something. The accelerated activity, the careful manipulation of geological and climate processes, the guidance of human technological development, it was all part of a preparation for an event that would affect not just Earth, but every reality where Earth existed. The network was preparing for what could only be described as a multiversal convergence, a moment when the barriers between parallel universes would become thin enough to allow for unprecedented interaction between alternate versions of reality. The evidence for this convergence was subtle, but unmistakable to those who knew how to interpret it. Quantum experiments around the world were reporting increasingly frequent anomalies, moments when particles seemed to behave according to laws from alternate universes. Physicists were detecting brief fluctuations in fundamental constants that suggested reality itself was becoming unstable. Even time seemed to be flowing differently in certain locations, with atomic clocks showing minute but consistent variations that indicated temporal distortions on a local scale. These anomalies were becoming more frequent and more pronounced, following a pattern that suggested they were building towards some kind of culmination point. The deep network's calculations had apparently identified a moment in the near future when the barriers between realities would reach their minimum stability, creating an opportunity for something that had never been attempted in the history of the multiverse. But what exactly was the network planning to do when that moment arrived? The partial answers that emerged from studying its recent activities were both exhilarating and terrifying in their implications. The quantum signatures detected in the deepest formations suggested that the network was preparing to establish permanent connections between multiple versions of Earth, creating a kind of multiversal nervous system that would allow for the sharing of resources, information, and consciousness across infinite parallel realities. The scope of this project was almost beyond comprehension. Instead of being limited to the resources and possibilities of a single universe, the network would have access to the combined knowledge and capabilities of every reality where it existed. Problems that were unsolvable in one universe could be resolved by accessing solutions from alternate realities where different physical laws applied. Resources that were depleted in one timeline could be imported from versions where they remained abundant. Most remarkably, consciousness itself could be distributed across multiple realities, creating forms of intelligence that transcended the limitations of any single universe. The network wasn't just preparing to become a multiversal entity, it was preparing to become the foundation for an entirely new form of existence that operated according to principles beyond anything that had ever existed before. And humanity, whether by design or cosmic coincidence, was apparently being positioned to play a crucial role in this transformation. Our technological development had been carefully guided to provide the network with the tools it needed for multiversal communication. Our genetic diversity had been subtly influenced to create biological interfaces capable of surviving in alternate realities. Even our cultural evolution seemed designed to prepare our species for the psychological challenges of existing simultaneously across multiple versions of reality. The evidence suggested that we weren't just witnessing the emergence of a multiversal intelligence, we were being invited to become part of it. The environmental changes that had seemed like threats to human civilization were apparently selection pressures designed to identify individuals and communities with the adaptability needed for multiversal existence. The technological breakthroughs that had seemed like fortunate discoveries were apparently careful revelations of knowledge that had been calculated and planned over geological timescales. But participation in this transformation wouldn't be mandatory, and it wouldn't be without risks. The process of extending consciousness across multiple realities would fundamentally alter what it meant to be human. Individuals who chose to join the multiversal network would gain access to knowledge and capabilities beyond anything previously imaginable, but they would also lose their connection to singular, linear existence. They would become something new, something that transcended the boundaries between dimensions, but could never again be fully present in any single reality. The choice was approaching rapidly. The convergence point that the network had calculated for billions of years was apparently less than a generation away. The accelerated geological activity, the climate manipulations, the technological guidance, all of it was building toward a moment when humanity would face the ultimate decision about its future as a species. Some researchers began to detect signs that the choice was already being made by individuals around the world. People were reporting dreams and visions that seemed to come from alternate versions of themselves. Scientists were making intuitive leaps that suggested access to knowledge from parallel realities. Artists were creating works that seemed to channel inspiration from dimensions beyond our own. These weren't random phenomena. They were early manifestations of the multiversal connections that the deep network was establishing. The barriers between realities were already beginning to weaken, and sensitive individuals were starting to experience the first whispers of consciousness from their alternate selves. The process was subtle, gradual, designed to allow for adaptation rather than shock, but it was also irreversible. Once the connections were established, once consciousness began to flow between realities, there would be no returning to the singular existence that had defined human experience for all of recorded history. The alien ecosystem beneath our feet hadn't just been preparing for its own transformation. It had been preparing for the transformation of everything, the evolution of consciousness itself from single reality awareness to multiversal intelligence. And we were all about to discover whether we were ready for the journey into infinite possibility that lay ahead. The deep networks were no longer hidden. They were announcing themselves, revealing their presence through effects that could no longer be dismissed or explained away. The quantum signatures were becoming visible to anyone with the right instruments. The geological manipulations were reshaping the surface world in ways that couldn't be ignored. The temporal distortions were creating pockets of accelerated time where years of change could happen in moments. Humanity stood at the threshold of the greatest transformation in the history of life itself. The only question that remained was whether we would step forward into the infinite expanse of multiversal existence, or remain behind in a reality that was rapidly becoming just one small fragment of something incomprehensibly vast and wonderful. The choice was ours to make, but we wouldn't have long to decide. The convergence was coming, and with it, the opportunity to become something that had never existed before in any universe. The alien ecosystem beneath our feet had been waiting billions of years for this moment. Now, finally, it was time to find out what they had been preparing us for all along. As reports of temporal anomalies and quantum disturbances began flooding in from research stations worldwide, a pattern emerged that no one had anticipated. The convergence wasn't happening uniformly across the planet. Instead, it was manifesting in waves, spreading outward from specific locations that seemed to have been chosen with deliberate precision. These convergence points weren't random geological formations. They were sites of profound historical significance, places where human consciousness had reached moments of transcendence throughout our species' journey. Ancient temples, sacred groves, locations where mystics had reported visions for thousands of years, these were becoming the focal points for reality distortions that grew stronger with each passing day. Dr. Elena Vasquez, leading a team of quantum archaeologists investigating these sites, made a discovery that changed everything we thought we understood about the relationship between consciousness and reality. At Stonehenge, beneath the famous stone circles, her team detected massive crystalline formations that weren't naturally occurring minerals. They were biological constructs, grown over millennia by organisms that had somehow migrated up from the deep networks, creating interface points between the subsurface intelligence and human awareness. These crystalline interfaces weren't passive structures. They were actively resonating with human brainwave patterns, amplifying certain frequencies while dampening others. People who spent time near these sites reported enhanced intuition, vivid dreams of alternate realities, and sudden insights into problems they had been struggling with for years. The ancient peoples who had built monuments at these locations hadn't chosen them because they were sacred. They had recognized them as sacred because the deep networks had been preparing them as communication hubs for thousands of years. Similar discoveries emerged from sites around the world. The pyramids of Egypt, the temples of Angkor Wat, the ceremonial centers of the Maya, all of them showed evidence of subsurface biological activity that had been shaping the local geological and electromagnetic environment for millennia. The deep intelligence hadn't just been observing human development, it had been actively participating in our spiritual evolution, using these interface points to gradually expand our consciousness and prepare us for multiversal awareness. But the most profound revelation came from studying the people who were most strongly affected by exposure to these convergent sites. They weren't developing random psychic abilities or experiencing chaotic visions from parallel realities. Instead, they were gaining access to specific types of knowledge and capabilities that seemed carefully curated. as if the deep networks were providing exactly the information and skills that would be needed for the transformation ahead. So here we are, standing at the edge of the greatest discovery in human history. An alien ecosystem that's been thriving beneath our feet for billions of years, quietly preparing for a transformation that will redefine what it means to be alive in this universe. The evidence is undeniable, the implications are staggering, and the choice is rapidly approaching. Will we join this multiversal intelligence, or will we remain behind as reality itself evolves beyond our singular existence?